July 3, 1942. North Africa. A single British tank sits motionless on a desert ridge while 9 German Panzers burn around it. Inside, a corporal from the 9th Lancers has 3 rounds left and a weapon everyone says is useless. The Germans are regrouping. The radio is dead. And in 6 hours, this man will do something no one thought possible with a tank they'd already written off as a coffin on tracks. This is not a story about luck. This is about what happens when you refuse to die badly. The desert doesn't care about your story. It doesn't care if you're British or German, if you're winning or losing, if you've been fighting for 3 years or 3 days. The Western Desert is a place that erases men the way wind erases footprints. And by the summer of 1942, it had been erasing them in extraordinary numbers. The sand holds no memory. The sky offers no shade. And the war that crawled across North Africa that year moved like a plague, back and forth along a single coastal road, devouring divisions and spitting out wreckage. For the British 8th Army, the first days of July were not days of fighting. They were days of falling back. The word retreat was not used in the dispatches, but everyone knew what it meant when entire brigades were told to disengage, to pull back toward the Egyptian border, to trade space for time and hope that time would bring reinforcements before the Germans brought annihilation. The Battle of Gazala had ended in disaster. Tobruk, the fortress that had held for so long, had fallen in a single day. Rommel's Afrika Korps was driving east with a momentum that felt unstoppable, and behind the German advance lay a trail of burnt-out British tanks, abandoned supply dumps, and unmarked graves scratched into the hardpan. The Crusader tanks of the British armored regiments were part of that wreckage, though many of them were still moving, still fighting, still crewed by men who understood that the machines they rode into battle were dangerously outmatched. The Crusader was a cruiser tank, built for speed and maneuver, designed in an era when British doctrine still imagined tank battles as cavalry charges translated into steel. It was fast. It was agile. It was cramped, unreliable, prone to overheating, and armed with a 2-pounder gun that fired a solid shot roughly the size of a man's fist. Against German armor, this was increasingly a problem. The Panzer III carried a 50mm gun. The Panzer IV carried a 75mm gun with a high-explosive shell that could crack a Crusader's turret from 1,000 yards. British doctrine, however, required Crusader crews to close to within 300 or 400 yards before engaging, a distance at which the 2-pounder might penetrate German armor if the shot was perfect, if the angle was right, if the armor wasn't sloped, if the shell didn't shatter on impact. The war was full of ifs. Corporal Alfie Nichols knew all of this, though not in the language of technical manuals or staff college lectures. He knew it the way a man knows cold water or hot metal, through direct and repeated contact. He was 24 years old, a gunner in the 9th Lancers, a regiment with a history that stretched back to the British cavalry of the Napoleonic Wars but which now fought in tanks that broke down more often than they broke through. Nichols had joined before the war, one of the last peacetime enlistments, and he had trained on tanks that were already obsolete by the time the fighting began. He was not an officer. He was not a tactician. He was a man who sat in a steel box, peered through a gun sight, and tried to hit moving targets before they hit him. He was good at this, better than most, quiet about it, the kind of soldier other men trusted without quite knowing why. The 9th Lancers had been in the desert since 1941, long enough for the sand to work its way into every seam and hinge of their equipment, long enough for the men to stop thinking of England as a place they would return to and start thinking of it as a place that might not exist anymore by the time the war ended. They had fought at Sidi Rezegh. They had fought in the grinding battles around Gazala. They had watched other regiments vanish in an afternoon, entire squadrons lost to a single ambush or a well-placed artillery barrage. They had learned that survival in the desert depended less on courage than on small things. Knowing when to move and when to stay still, understanding the light at different hours, recognizing the shapes of enemy tanks before they recognized you, and never, ever assuming that today would be easier than yesterday. By July 3rd, the regiment was near a low escarpment called Ruisat Ridge, a desolate stretch of rock and sand that marked the last defensible position before the coastal plain opened up toward Alexandria and the Suez Canal. If the Germans broke through here, there was nothing between them and Egypt except distance, and distance was something the Afrika Korps had proven very good at covering. The British were digging in, but digging in meant something different in the desert than it did in Europe. There were no trenches to speak of, no forests, no buildings. There was rock, sand, heat, and the constant awareness that the horizon could fill with enemy armor at any moment. Nichols's tank was positioned on the ridge itself, part of a defensive screen meant to slow any German probe while the main body of the Eighth Army repositioned further east. It was not a prestigious assignment. It was not even a particularly strategic one. It was the kind of position given to units that were understrength, undersupplied, or simply in the wrong place when orders were handed down. The Crusader sat low behind a shallow rise, hull down, only the turret exposed. The crew had been there since before dawn, waiting, watching, drinking water that tasted like metal and eating rations that tasted like dust. Inside the tank, the heat was monstrous. The sun had been climbing since first light, and by mid-morning the interior of the Crusader was an oven. The metal burned to the touch. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of oil, cordite, sweat, and the faint acrid tang of electrical components running too hot. The engine idled with a low, rattling growl, a sound that vibrated through the hull and into the bones of the crew. Nichols sat in the gunner's position, his eye pressed to the rubber cup of the gun sight, his hands resting on the traversing controls. The world outside was reduced to a small, bright circle of desert, shimmering in the heat. He could see perhaps a mile, maybe less. The air distorted everything. Rocks became tanks. Tanks became mirages. Nothing was certain until it was close. The radio crackled occasionally, brief bursts of static and terse commands, but mostly it was silent. The regiment had orders to hold, to observe, to report, not to advance, not to engage unless engaged first. The Germans were out there, somewhere, moving in columns that stretched for miles, and the British were hoping to avoid contact until reinforcements arrived or the enemy overextended. It was the kind of hope that felt thin in the desert sun. Then, just after 10 in the morning, the horizon changed. At first it was only dust, a low smudge against the pale sky, but dust in the desert meant movement, and movement meant something was coming. Nichols adjusted the traverse, scanning left to right, waiting for shapes to resolve out of the shimmer. The commander's voice came through the intercom, calm but tight. Enemy armor. Range unknown. Stand by. The loader shifted behind Nichols, checking the ready rounds, making sure the 2-pounder shells were positioned correctly in the racks. The driver said nothing. There was nothing to say. The shapes clarified slowly, painfully. Panzer IIIs moving in a loose column, perhaps a dozen of them, advancing across open ground toward the ridge. They were not rushing. They were not cautious. They were moving with the confidence of an army that had been winning for months, that had chased the British across hundreds of miles and had no reason to expect this day to be different. Behind them, further back, Nichols could see the heavier silhouettes of Panzer IVs, the tanks with the guns that could kill a Crusader from outside the range at which a Crusader could fight back. The British doctrine was clear. Wait, let them close. The 2-pounder was effective only at close range, and close range meant danger, but there was no choice. Engaging at distance would waste ammunition and reveal your position without result. So you waited. You let the enemy come closer. You sat in your steel coffin and watched them approach, and you did not fire until you could see the details of their hull, the markings on their turrets, the faces of their commanders standing in the open hatches. Nichols's breathing slowed. His hands steadied. This was not his first engagement. He had been through this before, the waiting, the fear that sat in the stomach like cold water, the knowledge that the next few minutes would determine whether he lived or died and that the decision was not entirely his to make. Tank combat was not like infantry combat. There was no cover to dive behind, no ground to hug. You were locked inside a machine, and if that machine was hit, you burned or you drowned in your own blood or you were crushed when the turret collapsed. The men who survived tank battles were not the bravest. They were the ones who made fewer mistakes, who fired first, who understood angles and distance and the way armor behaved under impact. Nichols understood these things. The German tanks kept coming. 800 yards. 700. The heat inside the Crusader was unbearable now, but Nichols ignored it. His world had narrowed to the circle of his gun sight, to the crosshairs centered on the lead Panzer III, to the calculations running in his head about range and deflection and the moment when waiting would turn into dying. At 600 yards, the commander gave the order. Fire. Nichols squeezed the trigger. The 2-pounder cracked, a sharp, violent sound that made the whole tank shudder. The spent shell casing ejected with a clang. The loader slammed another round into the breech. Nichols kept his eye on the target, watching. At this range, even a good hit might not penetrate. The shot had to strike flat, had to hit a weak point, had to catch the armor at the right angle. The lead Panzer slewed sideways, smoke pouring from its engine deck. The crew bailed out, small figures tumbling into the sand. One down. But the others had seen the shot. They knew where it came from. The German tanks began to spread out, maneuvering, bringing their guns to bear. Nichols traversed right, tracking the next target, breathing slowly, waiting for the loader to confirm the gun was ready. The Panzers were firing now, high explosive rounds that screamed overhead or impacted on the ridge, throwing up geysers of rock and sand. One hit close enough to shower the Crusader with debris. The noise inside the tank was deafening. A chaos of engine roar, gunfire, impacts, and the harsh breathing of men trying not to panic. Nichols fired again. A hit on the turret, but the Panzer kept moving. The shell had failed to penetrate. He traversed, adjusted, fired again. This time the Panzer lurched to a halt, flames licking from the hatches. 2 down. The next 30 minutes became a kind of hell that had no narrative, only repetition. Identify, traverse, fire, reload, traverse, fire. The Crusaders' position was exposed now, and the Germans concentrated their fire on the ridge, but Nichols did not move. Moving would mean losing the slight advantage of the hull-down position, and advantage in the desert was measured in inches. He fired until the barrel of the 2-pounder was so hot it glowed faintly in the dim light inside the turret. He fired until his shoulder ached from the recoil and his eye was bruised from the gun sight and his ears rang so badly he could barely hear the commander's orders. 3 Panzers burning. 4. 5. The Germans pulled back, regrouped, came at the ridge from a different angle. Nichols turned the turret, tracked them, fired. A shell struck the Crusader's front armor, a glancing blow that left a long gouge in the steel but did not penetrate. The tank rocked. The driver swore. The loader kept feeding shells into the breech, mechanical, automatic, because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant realizing how insane this was. 6 Panzers burning now, black smoke rising into the white sky. The ammunition racks were emptying. Nichols could feel the weight of each remaining shell, the knowledge that every shot had to count because there would not be enough to waste. He was not thinking about heroism. He was thinking about geometry, about angles and distance, and the way a Panzer's armor was thickest at the front and weakest at the sides. He was thinking about survival, not glory, about making the next shot count so that there would be a shot after that. 7. 8. The German attack faltered. The remaining Panzers began to withdraw, pulling back beyond effective range, leaving their burning comrades scattered across the approach to the ridge. The smoke hung in the still air, thick and oily, a monument to the violence of the last half hour. Inside the Crusader, the crew sat in silence, panting, soaked in sweat, waiting to see if the Germans would come again. They did. Just after noon, a second column appeared, moving cautiously this time, trying to flank the ridge from the south. Nichols swung the turret, his movements slower now, his body exhausted but his mind still sharp. The loader was struggling, his hands shaking as he fed rounds into the gun. The commander's voice was hoarse, cracked, but still giving orders. Range. Target. Fire. The 9th Panzer died at 400 yards, a perfect shot through the side armor that detonated the ammunition inside. The tank exploded, the turret lifting off the hull and tumbling end over end before crashing into the sand. After that, the Germans stopped coming. The desert was silent again, or as silent as it ever got, the kind of quiet that was really just the absence of gunfire, filled instead with the tick of cooling metal, the distant rumble of engines, the wind moving across the sand. Nichols leaned back from the gun sight. His face was black with powder residue. His hands were trembling. The ready rack was almost empty. 3 rounds left. 49 fired. 9 confirmed kills, probably more that were damaged or disabled but not destroyed. The crew sat in the heat, too tired to speak, too stunned to process what had just happened. The Germans did not attack again that day. The British did not advance. The line held, barely, a temporary stalemate in a war that would grind on for months more. But on that ridge, on that morning, something had happened that would echo through the regimental histories, through the after-action reports, through the intelligence summaries compiled from aerial reconnaissance and intercepted radio traffic. A single Crusader, a tank everyone knew was obsolete, had stopped a German armored probe and inflicted losses that forced a unit of the Afrika Korps to reconsider its approach. The confirmation came later. Reconnaissance flights photographed the wrecks. Radio intercepts mentioned the losses. Reports filtered up through the chain of command. General Bernard Montgomery, who would later take command of the 8th Army and drive Rommel back across the desert, saw the reports and made a note of the action. The name Corporal Alfie Nichols appeared in the dispatches, a rare thing for a gunner, a man whose job was to be invisible behind his sights. But Nichols did not stop. The war did not stop. The 9th Lancers were pulled back, re-equipped, sent forward again. Nichols was promoted eventually, though not quickly. He transitioned to Sherman tanks when the Americans began supplying armor that could finally match the Germans. He fought in North Africa as the tide turned, as the British pushed west and the Afrika Korps was trapped and destroyed. He fought in Italy, where the terrain was different but the violence was the same, where tanks struggled up mountain roads and men died in the mud just as they had died in the sand. He survived all of it, not unscathed, but alive. When the war ended and the armies went home, Nichols returned to England, to a country that had been bombed and starved and exhausted, and he slipped back into civilian life with the same quietness he had brought to his military service. He did not speak much about the war. Most men didn't. The ones who talked were often the ones who had seen the least. The ones who had seen the most carried it differently, in silence, in the way they startled at loud noises or stared at nothing for long stretches. The story of Ruisat Ridge became a footnote, preserved mainly in regimental histories, in dusty archives, in the memories of men who had been there and who grew old and died and took their memories with them. Nichols's name appeared occasionally in books about tank warfare, in articles about forgotten actions of the North African campaign, but he was not famous. He did not want to be. Fame was for generals and politicians. He had been a soldier, and soldiers did their job and came home if they were lucky, and that was enough. But the record remains. 9 German tanks destroyed in one morning by a single gunner in a tank that was not supposed to be able to do what he did. 49 rounds fired, 3 remaining when the shooting stopped. A defense that held when it should have broken. A man who refused to die badly. The desert has erased most of the evidence now. The wrecks were salvaged or buried by the sand. The ridge looks the same as it did before the war. A low rise of rock and dirt under a merciless sun. There are no monuments. There are no plaques. The men who fought there are almost all gone, and the generation that remembers them is going too. But history, if you look closely, leaves marks. In the reports, in the records, in the stories passed down through regiments and families. In the knowledge that on a single day in the summer of 1942, when the war in North Africa hung in the balance and the British were retreating and the Germans seemed unstoppable, one man sat in an obsolete tank and made a choice. Not to run. Not to surrender. Not to die without making it cost something. The war was full of men like Alfie Nichols, men whose names never made the newspapers, whose actions were recorded in terse, bureaucratic language and filed away and forgotten. The war was also full of men who did less and were remembered more, because memory is not about fairness. It is about narrative, about who tells the story and when and why. Nichols's story was told quietly, in rooms where veterans gathered, in the careful records kept by historians who understood that war is not made by generals alone but by thousands of individual actions, most of them small, some of them extraordinary. What makes a man hold his ground when every instinct says to run? What makes a man fire 49 times into an enemy that outnumbers him, outguns him, and will kill him if he makes a single mistake? The easy answer is duty. The true answer is more complicated. It is training in fear and stubbornness and the knowledge that your crew is depending on you and that the men on the ridge to your left and right are depending on you and that if you break, they break, and if they break, the line breaks, and if the line breaks, the war might be lost. Nichols did not think in those terms. He thought about the next shot, the next target, the next breath. He survived the day not because he was fearless but because he was disciplined, because he had done this so many times that the fear became background noise, something he could work through rather than something that paralyzed him. That is what training does. It does not remove fear. It teaches you to function despite it. The Battle of El Alamein would come later that year, the great turning point, the victory that Churchill would call the end of the beginning. Nichols would be there too, in a Sherman this time, part of the armored divisions that broke Rommel's line and sent the Afrika Korps into retreat. But El Alamein was a battle of thousands, a clash of armies and doctrines and industrial might. Ruisat Ridge was a battle of one, a man and his gun and his crew, and that is why it matters. Not because it changed the course of the war, but because it showed what could be done when everything else said it could not be done. The years after the war were quiet for Nichols. He worked. He raised a family. He aged the way all men age, slowly and then quickly, the strength of youth fading into the aches and limitations of older years. He did not write a memoir. He did not give speeches. When asked about the war, he answered briefly, factually, without drama. That was the day we held the ridge. That was the day the Panzers came. We stopped them. That was all. But the men who served with him remembered. The historians who studied the campaign remembered. And the record, dry and factual as it is, remembers. 9 tanks. One morning. A weapon that was supposed to be useless in the hands of a man who refused to accept that. There is a tendency, when telling stories about war, to make them about heroism, to frame them as tales of courage overcoming impossible odds, to turn soldiers into legends and battles into myths. This is a mistake. It is not that courage does not exist or that heroism is not real. It is that these words flatten the experience, reduce it to something simple and digestible when the truth is always more complicated. Nichols was not a hero in the way we imagine heroes. He was a man doing a job under conditions that would break most people, and he did it well enough to survive and to make the enemy pay for every yard of ground they tried to take. That is what war is. Not glory, not adventure, just men trying to stay alive and complete their mission and go home, and sometimes those men do extraordinary things not because they are extraordinary people but because the situation demands it and they happen to be the ones in position to respond. The Crusader tanks are gone now, scrapped or rusting in museums, relics of a doctrine that proved inadequate and a war that demanded adaptation. The 2-pounder gun is a curiosity, a footnote in the evolution of anti-tank weaponry. The desert has moved on, fought over in other wars, divided by borders that did not exist in 1942, populated by people who have no memory of the steel monsters that once roamed across it. But the story remains, encoded in archives, in regimental histories, in the fading recollections of a generation that is almost gone. And perhaps that is enough. Not every story needs to be famous. Not every act of courage needs to be celebrated. Some things are remembered simply because they happened, because they were true, because they show us something about what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. Corporal Alfie Nichols held a ridge in the western desert on the 3rd of July, 1942. He fired 49 rounds from a gun that was obsolete before the war began. He destroyed 9 German tanks in a single morning and forced an enemy armored column to withdraw. He survived the day and the war and returned home to a quiet life that left no headlines. The desert remembers nothing, but we can. If the story of forgotten heroism and the brutal arithmetic of armored warfare moved you, consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. It helps ensure that stories like Alfie Nichols's, stories buried in regimental archives and fading memories, continue to be told. I want to ask you something. How many other soldiers like Nichols fought with obsolete equipment and impossible odds, survived or didn't, and left no record at all? How much of history is written by the loud and the famous while the quiet and the competent disappear? Share your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you know stories from your own family's history or from units that never made the textbooks. The men who fought these small, desperate battles deserve to be remembered, even if the desert has forgotten them.